There we go. So I'm ready now, so I'll introduce you, okay?
Thank you.
Good afternoon and welcome to Carlam Cymru revision sessions. This session will focus on A-level psychology and will be presented by Sophie Bellis from the Allen School. The session will last around 45 minutes, where the teacher will go through the relevant subject content. If you have any questions, please use the question and answer section and we will endeavour to answer your question during the session. The session will be recorded, with the recording and any relevant resources uploaded to the e-sgol website in the Carlam Cymru area. Thank you, Sophie, when you're ready.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, hi everyone. I just want to quickly start by going through what I intend to do with these 4 A-level psychology sessions that we've been given. I know that there are, within this unit, we're looking at unit 3, there are lots of different types of behaviours that you can look at, and your centre, your school, gets to choose which behaviours to look at. So some of this will be relevant to some of you, but some of it may not, because your school will be looking at a different behaviour. But what was relevant to everybody is the exam technique that I'll be going through as I go through these questions. So even if the content might not be relevant, the exam practice definitely will. I'm going to focus mainly on the behaviour of schizophrenia. I'm going to start today by looking at our biological explanation, which is dopamine hypothesis. And then we're going to move on and look at structural brain abnormalities next week. And then I'm going to look at some of the individual differences, explanations of schizophrenia. And then our final session, the 4th session, will be exam technique for unit 3. So each session will have some exam technique, but I'll focus it mainly on that session 4. Okay, so just linking this then to your exam. So we are within unit 3 here. You will have done unit 1 and unit 2 last year, and unit 3 is implications of the real world. So you are expected to study behaviours. Normally it's 3 behaviours, but with the changes to your specification, we are looking at only 2 behaviours this year. And then you also have the controversies as well within this section, which is quite similar to the debates that you did last year. There are already some of these Carlam Cymraeg sessions on the website for controversies, which were done last year. Okay, so within this Unit 3 exam, you have 2 sections, like I've just said. Section A are your behaviours and Section B are your controversies. Within Section A, this is what your teachers are given to make sure that you're able to do for the exam. So it says, the study of behaviours, learners must choose to study 3 from 6 nominated behaviours. And the section that I've put in red here is what we're going to focus on today. So it says that you should know the characteristics of the behaviour. So you should have that underlying knowledge of what the behaviour is and how we can classify it. And you need to understand biological, individual differences and social psychological explanations for that behaviour. So that's where I'm going to focus this session today. After that, you should be able to evaluate the different explanations of the behaviour and apply it to methods of modifying a behaviour. A method of modifying is just a treatment of a behaviour. And then the last thing is to be able to evaluate those methods of modifying. So what's good about the treatment, what's not so good, what could we do to improve it in the future? Okay, so sticking to our theme then of schizophrenia, that is our main behaviour for today. We know that schizophrenia is a form of psychosis where you lose touch with reality. You don't know what is real and what isn't, and it shows itself in lots of different types of symptoms. You have your positive symptoms and your negative symptoms. Positive meaning in addition to normal behaviour, and negative meaning withdrawn or taken away from normal behaviour. So we are going to reference a lot of the characteristics of schizophrenia today, and it's something that you will need to know no matter what question you're asked on that behaviour in the exam. Your characteristics are really important. Okay, so our characteristics also come into this biological explanation. Now, there's two different types of explanations within this umbrella of biology. So you've got the dopamine hypothesis and structural abnormalities. And today I'm going to go through the dopamine hypothesis. I've chosen to go through this because it's quite daunting and it's quite biological, which, unless you also study biology, it can be one of the most difficult elements of the course, because although it's very important in psychology, it's also quite different and it's got some really tricky concepts to grasp. So I'm hoping that this allows you to sort of understand the process of the dopamine hypothesis a little bit more. All right then, so dopamine hypothesis. Dopamine, we know, is a neurotransmitter, and it's the main neurotransmitter that is associated with schizophrenia. We should all be aware that when somebody has schizophrenia, they have too much dopamine in their brain. Their brain is flooded with dopamine. It's the neurotransmitter that's responsible for arousal and pleasure and being sort of overstimulated from environmental stimuli. And it's all to do with being around people and the relationships as well that you get from people and how they make you feel. So that's our main neurotransmitter. And a hypothesis, we should all know this from last year, a hypothesis is a prediction. So the dopamine hypothesis is just a prediction about dopamine. It's an idea and it's a theory about how dopamine causes schizophrenia. Okay, so it says on the screen, we know that physical illnesses can be explained by looking at the body for injuries. We know that we could look at somebody's leg and think, right, that is broken. Okay, that is a physical illness, that leg is broken. So surely it's got to be the same for a mental illness. Well, that's not true. It's really hard to look for a mental illness because sometimes there isn't an obvious physical difference in somebody. It doesn't really present itself, in a rash, or you don't get spots, or it's not a breakage of the skin. So it's really, really difficult to locate where a physical illness is because sometimes it's not obvious. So this is why it's really difficult to, first of all, diagnose schizophrenia, but also understand the different symptoms that people have, because some people might have a hallucination and you would think, oh, okay, well, that's definitely schizophrenia. But then some people may have alogia, which we know is poverty of speech, so they don't talk very much. And it's really difficult to understand, well, if they're not talking very much, is it schizophrenia? Could it be linked to depression? Are they just having a bad day? So it's really, really hard to pinpoint what causes this type of mental illness because it's difficult to see. But one of the really common explanations of schizophrenia is the biological one. It's the one that people go to first because it's objective, it's really scientific, and it's got lots of evidence to back it up. It might be because it's seen as a medical condition, and most commonly it's treated with drugs. And if something's treated with drugs, it must have a biological cause. So that's where this idea of looking at a biological explanation of schizophrenia has come from, because we know that drugs make it better, so it must be biology. Okay, something to start off with then, and this is definitely something that I would bring into the very beginning of your essays, because the idea is that you need to show the examiner that you have a full understanding of the process of dopamine in the brain. So we need to know about neurotransmitters and we need to know about synaptic transmission. So synaptic transmission is the process that a neurotransmitter goes through your brain to enable you to behave in a certain way. And the process of synaptic transmission you can see on the screen now in written form. It's quite wordy, as you can see, but what there are some key words which would be really handy for you to grasp and use in your essays. So it says at the top, neurotransmitters are chemical messengers that transmit signals from a neuron to a target cell across a synapse. All they're doing is telling the brain what to do, telling the brain how to behave. Neurotransmitters are packed into a synaptic vesicle, which is just a little sac which your neurotransmitters sit in all together, and they are clustered beneath the membrane in the axon terminal on the presynaptic side of the synapse. So before something happens, your neurotransmitters are all together in a vesicle. Then what happens is an action potential or a chemical or an electrical impulse causes your neurotransmitters to be released, and they diffuse across something called your synaptic cleft. So your synaptic cleft is a really, really tiny gap between two neurons, and they essentially diffuse across it and attached to the other side of the neuron. They bind to the specific receptors in the membrane on the postsynaptic side of the synapse, and I'm going to show you this in a diagram in a minute. So if it's a bit wordy, don't worry. The release of neurotransmitters usually follows the arrival of an action potential, and then obviously they are then released and they diffuse across this synaptic cleft. Okie dokie, let me show you that in a picture. So here we go. Now this picture is labelled, and in the exam you would only be asked to write about it. You would never be asked to actually label the diagram, because obviously this is an essay-based exam, isn't it? But we know that an action potential travels down here. These here are your vesicles, and you've got your neurotransmitters, so your dopamine in the case of schizophrenia. They're all packed into these circles. They then diffuse here, this is your synaptic cleft, this gap, and they bind here to your receptor sites on your postsynaptic neuron. So they're essentially going from here to here. Now what happens in schizophrenia is there's just too much dopamine, okay? The brain is flooded with it. So there's way too much dopamine here, and lots and lots of dopamine bind to the receptor sites on your postsynaptic neuron, which means that your behaviour then becomes different or abnormal. And that's when you can start showing the signs of psychosis. Okie dokie. So that is the first bit that I would include in your essay. This idea of synaptic transmission, that we know that dopamine is our main neurotransmitter associated with schizophrenia, and the way it works is through synaptic transmission. The second part then is, well, how do they know that it's dopamine? Why do we know that dopamine is the main neurotransmitter with schizophrenia? And actually, they sort of stumbled upon it by accident, in a way, when they were looking at people with Parkinson's disease. So we know that Parkinson's disease is a degenerative disease in the brain, and it can affect your muscles and your cognition. So what they did is people with Parkinson's disease were treated with L-Dopa. Now, L-Dopa is a drug that contains dopamine, and they can experience psychotic side effects that mimic the symptoms of schizophrenia. So they would have somebody with Parkinson's disease, they would give them this dopamine increasing drug, and they'd start to get symptoms of schizophrenia. And that's where they started to think, well, hang on a minute, if we're increasing dopamine and they're showing signs of schizophrenia, then there's got to be a link between those two things. This then led to the finding that dopamine must be in some way involved in the experience of psychosis in those with schizophrenia. And the finding out about the role of the dopaminergic pathway is called the dopamine hypothesis. Now, the dopaminergic pathway I'm going to come on to later on in my presentation, but that's how it started. So doctors then began treating schizophrenics with drugs that block the dopamine pathways in the brain. So they managed to reverse it. And the result was that the patients actually started to experience Parkinson's-like symptoms, such as shaking. So there was a real distinct link between the two there. So that's a nice piece of research for you to put into the very, very start of your essay, whilst you're also talking about synaptic transmission. Now, on my PowerPoint, and you will all have access to the PowerPoint after the session, there is a video. I'm not going to play it now, but the video explains what I've just said, but gives you an example where you can see a person with Parkinson's disease and the impact that L-DOPA has on them. Okie dokie, so this next bit is a diagram of that dopaminergic pathway, which I just mentioned. So I don't want you to worry about the bit at the bottom. We want to look here at our mesocortical pathway and our mesolimbic pathway. So here, this side, this is your cerebellum here, and this is your brain stem. Your cerebellum is obviously, as we know, at the back of the brain. So our positive symptoms are more associated with this mesolimbic pathway at the back of the brain, and our negative symptoms are associated with our mesocortical pathway at the front of the brain here around your frontal cortex. This will make a little bit more sense to you once I go through the dopamine hypothesis, but these are your dopaminergic pathways that you need to be aware of. Okay, so the initial dopamine hypothesis is that too much dopamine causes schizophrenia. That's all people knew. They didn't know any more to it. And it ended up not really giving us much to go off. It didn't really tell us anything, just that maybe they need a drug that reduces the amount of dopamine in the brain. So it was quite a basic concept. It was too basic. And what they needed to do was they wanted a more holistic view of schizophrenia. So we know that maybe too much dopamine in the brain showed positive symptoms, but we never got an explanation of the negative symptoms. So it says they had little or no effect on those individuals who suffered mainly negative symptoms of schizophrenia. So remember, your negative symptoms are avolition, alogia, anhedonia, flatness of affect, some sides of catatonic behaviour as well. So that explanation does not fit schizophrenia. It fits the positive symptoms, so your hallucinations and your delusions, but not your negative symptoms. So what do they do from there? Okay, dopamine is more associated with positive symptoms, but we don't have an explanation for negative symptoms. So the way that they looked at this was Griffith et al. Did a piece of research. So what he did was he induced psychosis using drugs. So he had a sample, a volunteer sample. They were fully, informed on what they had to do. So hopefully our ethics side of our mind is thinking, okay, so they had to agree to take a drug that they knew was going to induce psychosis. The drug that they used was dextroamphetamine. So that was just a normal drug which contained more dopamine than the normal functioning brain would produce. And they started to show signs of delusion and paranoia. So that showed us, oh, okay, so you've got a normal brain, you've increased the amount of dopamine in the brain, they're starting to show signs of schizophrenia, right? Well, we know then there's definitely a link between dopamine and schizophrenia, maybe more our positive symptoms, but what about our negative symptoms? So Griffith et al. Is a really nice piece of research to bring into the very start of your explanation of the dopamine hypothesis. Okay, so we know it's too simple. So what do we do from there? Well, how do we get this more holistic view of schizophrenia? they need more detailed research. We needed a little bit more brain scanning. We needed a bit more sort of objective scientific research to understand the role of dopamine in the brain, because we know that schizophrenia is so complex, it cannot be biologically explained by just saying, oh, well, it's just too much dopamine. There's definitely more to it. And that's when they stumbled across an area of the brain called your limbic system. So your limbic system is the orange structure on the picture that's on the slide currently. It's very, very central in your brain, and it's in charge of lots of different types of behaviour. So things like memory, your emotions, and they looked there and they found these subtypes of dopamine receptor site. So you've got to remember, a receptor site is almost like a door that collects dopamine. Now they found lots of those doors, lots of those rooms in the limbic system, and they labelled those receptor sites D1 to D5. And they were widely distributed in the limbic system. So we know that dopamine is quite heavily focused in that limbic system. Of particular interest was the D2 receptor, and some research done by Seaman and Lee had shown the impact of an antipsychotic drug on this specific type of receptor. So we know that the D2 receptor has a little bit more to do with dopamine and schizophrenia than the others, and that's why it became particular interest, because it had a reaction to an antipsychotic drug. D2 receptors are found primarily in subcortical regions. Subcortical just means in the centre of the brain. The limbic system then became the main focus of the dopamine hypothesis. So we are now one step closer. Okay, we know too much dopamine causes schizophrenia, but now we know that there's an area of our brain called the limbic system, and within that system there's 5 specific receptors and one even more important receptor that deal with schizophrenia. So we're getting closer to having that more holistic view and a bit more to our explanation. Seaman and Lee's research is really, really nice. And when we look at this essay plan that I've written, it's really important that you include research where you can. It shows depth of your answer, and obviously when we examine, we're looking for depth and range. So anytime you can add in a researcher, it would be really, really good. Okay, it would make your answer much stronger. Okay, so this is when they had this revised dopamine hypothesis. Now they've got this new idea because they found something within the limbic system. So the role of dopamine in the limbic system has been the main area of study in more recent years. Nerve pathways lead from the limbic system to many other subcortical structures and also to the cortex. We know that the cortex is that very top section of your brain. We know a little bit about pathways already from the diagram I explained with your dopaminergic pathways going forwards and backwards. So 2 of the main pathways associated with schizophrenia are our mesolimbic pathway and our mesocortical pathway. And then these became really, really important in helping us explain positive and negative symptoms. So looking closely then at our mesolimbic pathway. Dopamine is a major neurotransmitter in the mesolimbic pathway. So that's a tick, isn't it? Straight away, we know dopamine is associated with schizophrenia, which means that this is getting us closer to a better explanation. The pathway carries signals from the ventral tegmental area to the nucleus accumbens. Now, those are 2 areas of your brain that are really important when looking at the way that dopamine travels. So the ventral tegmental area is right in the centre of your limbic system, and the nucleus accumbens is near the back of your head. Now, you will never have to label or explain where they are. You just need to know that the mesolimbic pathway sends dopamine backwards. That's the dopaminergic pathway. Too much dopamine, either from neurons that fire too often or too quickly, cause overstimulation and ultimately positive symptoms of schizophrenia, such as hallucinations and delusions. So we know that our mesolimbic pathway is to do with the positive symptoms of schizophrenia. Antipsychotic drugs reduce dopaminergic neurotransmission, so they dampen down how much dopamine is in your brain, and they reduce dopamine activity in this pathway, which means if we don't have as much dopamine in that pathway, we don't have as many positive symptoms of schizophrenia. So we have gone from that initial hypothesis of too much dopamine causes schizophrenia to understanding that it's specific receptors within the limbic system, and it's also the mesolimbic pathway that controls and influences those positive symptoms. So we're much closer now to a more detailed and more holistic view of schizophrenia. And then we've got our mesocortical pathway. So dopamine, again, is a major neurotransmitter in the mesocortical pathway, which is good because we know dopamine is associated with schizophrenia. And then this pathway carries signals from the ventral tegmental area to our frontal cortex. So like I said before, ventral tegmental area is in the middle of your limbic system, and our frontal cortex is right here at the very, very front. This nerve pathway is vital in emotional response, motivation, and cognition. Now, if you think about your characteristics, your negative characteristics of schizophrenia, so things like alogia, avolition, anhedonia, they are all associated with those 3 points that are in blue. An emotional response, motivation, wanting to do clubs and see your friends, laughing, joking with your friends, all of that becomes very monotone when you have a negative symptom of schizophrenia. So this pathway is definitely leaning more towards an explanation of the negative symptoms, because the pathway is vital for things that are affected by schiz. So a little bit of research here, and again, really important that we bring that into our essay. Kenneth Davis et al. Notes that too little dopamine, so hypofunction, is evident in the D1 receptor of the frontal cortex of many individuals with cognitive impairments and negative symptoms of schizophrenia. So we know it's too much dopamine in that mesolimbic pathway, so that causes our positive symptoms, but actually too little dopamine in our frontal cortex, or traveling to our frontal cortex, results in the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. So those are our two pathways, mesolimbic, mesocortical. And then here they are again on that diagram of the dopaminergic pathways. So you've got your negative symptoms here at the front, mesocortical pathway, taking dopamine from your ventral tegmental area here, forward to your frontal cortex. And then you've got a description of your positive symptoms here, the back of the brain, taking dopamine from your ventral tegmental area and backwards to your nucleus accumbens. So they are your pathways. That is how dopamine travels through your brain. So a little recap of what we've done so far then, and I think the best way to look at this is almost like a story, because there is a lot to it and it is very scientific. And there's lots of keywords and terminology to remember and include in your answer. So starting off with the idea of synaptic transmission, we know how neurotransmitters move through the brain. And we also know that if an antipsychotic drug can treat something biological, then the cause of it has to be biological. Then they wanted to know, right, well, hang on then, where's this idea of dopamine and its link with schizophrenia come from? And it's the idea of L-DOPA and Parkinson's disease. People with Parkinson's were given a drug that increased dopamine and they showed symptoms of schizophrenia. So there's our clear link between the two. But it was too basic to start off with. There was no explanation of negative symptoms. It wasn't holistic enough. It didn't give us a full overview of the symptoms of schizophrenia. So they went back to research, right? What else can we look at in the brain that can give us more evidence of dopamine and schizophrenia? They found the limbic system, that structure right in the centre of the brain. And of particular interest was that D2 receptor site. Why? Because it had an impact, it was impacted by an antipsychotic drug. That enabled us to then understand that there's two pathways in the brain. There's two that go, one that goes forward and one that goes backwards, mesolimbic and our mesocortical pathway. Remember that our mesolimbic pathway goes backwards. It's our positive symptoms of schizophrenia, ventral tegmental area to our nucleus accumbens, and the mesocortical pathway, negative symptoms of schizophrenia, ventral tegmental area, forwards to our frontal cortex. And those four things, so the D2 receptor sites, our pathways, mesolimbic and mesocortical, give us a full explanation of both the positive and the negative symptoms, which is what we set out to do. So that is a recap of this dopamine hypothesis. And I think the easiest way to remember it is to put it in a story like that, because I know that there's a lot to it. Okay, so looking at then how we would tackle a question with this one. So a possible question that could come up would be outline the dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia. What you could also be asked is outline a biological explanation of schizophrenia, and then you could choose. Most often they are 10 marks. You could also be asked for a 5-mark question, which is difficult because you would need the same amount of content for 5 marks. So we're going to start bigger with the 10-mark questions to start off with. So on the screen, these are all of the elements that I definitely think you need to include in an answer. So the idea of neurotransmitters, the process of synaptic transmission, dopamine and early research into Parkinson's, the receptor sites within the limbic system, and then finally your mesolimbic and your mesocortical pathways. So that is a very, very brief essay plan for this question. What I've got here is a sample description of the dopamine hypothesis. I'm going to read it to you, and then I'm going to give it a little bit of feedback on why it's good, but also where improvement might need to be made. So it says, the dopamine hypothesis was too simple to start with and only explained some symptoms. After more research, it was evident that the limbic system has different receptors for dopamine. These were the D1 to D5 receptors. Of particular interest was the D2 receptor. From this, researchers found that there were 2 main dopamine pathways in the brain, the mesolimbic pathway and the mesocortical pathway. The mesolimbic explains positive symptoms and the mesocortical explains the negative symptoms. Okay, so what's good about this? It covers pretty much everything, doesn't it? It says about it being too simple to start with, and that they looked at more areas of the brain, and it's got the idea of the mesolimbic and mesocortical pathway. So it's showing range, isn't it? When we, from an examiner's point of view, range is there. I mean, there's definitely more they could talk about, but they are showing that they've got range in their answer. What's missing here is the depth. There's so much more to the dopamine hypothesis that they've missed out of this answer. So it's too simple to start with. Only explains some symptoms. What symptoms? Show the examiner that you know the characteristics of schizophrenia. Add them in. After more research, it was evident that the limbic system has different receptors for dopamine. Well, what is the limbic system? They haven't told me that they know what the limbic system is and the functions it has. These were the D1 to D5 receptors. Of particular interest was the D2 receptor. That's nice. It does show a little bit of depth. From this, researchers found that there were two main dopamine pathways in the brain. Okay. The mesolimbic and the mesocortical pathway. Mesolimbic explains positive symptoms. How? Okay. Where does it take dopamine to and from? There's no explanation of the ventral tegmental area to the nucleus accumbens. The mesocortical pathway explains the negative symptoms. How? Okay, so all they've done here is they've shown the examiner they have quite a basic knowledge really, and they've not gone into detail about the dopamine hypothesis. So in contrast to that one, let's have a look at this one. Now, this is much more detailed just by looking at it before you even read it. Now, what I've done here is I have added the bits in green. The words that are in green are the extra depth. The previous answer is just the bits that are still in black. So you can see here how much more detail this answer has. It says, the dopamine hypothesis stated that too much of the neurotransmitter dopamine was diffusing across the synaptic cleft and binding to the dopamine receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. This process of synaptic transmission was initially too simple and only explained positive symptoms such as hallucinations and delusions. So they've got that process of synaptic transmission in there. They've got some key words and they've shown me that they know what the positive symptoms of schizophrenia are. Research to support this idea was completed by Griffith et al. They induced psychosis on a sample of volunteers by administering dextroamphetamine. Perfect. Little bit of research in there. Shows depth and sort of supports the argument that you're making. Results showed that participants started to show early signs of schizophrenia, such as paranoia. Lovely. After more research, it was evident that the limbic system has different receptors for dopamine. The limbic system is a structure in the brain that controls our memory and emotions. Perfect, they've told me what the limbic system does. Then they've gone on to explain about your receptor sites, D1 to D5, of particular interest, D2. From this, the researchers found that there were two main dopamine pathways, and they've told me what those pathways are. The last bullet point is really important. It's showing the examiner that not only do you know the names of the pathways, but you know how they work. So it takes dopamine from that ventral tegmental area to the nucleus accumbens, and dopamine travels backwards in this pathway. This provides us with a further explanation of the positive symptoms. Secondly, there is a mesocortical pathway, which enables researchers to explain negative symptoms. Mesocortical pathway takes dopamine forwards from the ventral tegmental area to the frontal cortex. Due to too little dopamine in the frontal cortex, it can explain negative symptoms of schizophrenia, such as flatness of affect and avolition. I'm hoping that it's quite obvious there, the difference between these two answers. This second one has so much more depth, it's specific, and it's got some really lovely key terminology in it. And that's where the marks are. It's showing depth, it's showing range, and it's making sure you've got that terminology. Now, this answer isn't perfect. It hasn't mentioned anything about Parkinson's disease. They haven't put the research in there from Seaman and Lee. But it does show the examiner that this person has a real clear understanding of the dopamine hypothesis, and that is what we're aiming for. So I'm hoping that that shows the difference between depth and range and how to structure your answer a little bit better. Okay, so that is the end of this session today. I'm hoping that that has helped develop your understanding of the dopamine hypothesis. The next session that I'm going to do is on structural brain abnormalities, and that's also within our biological explanation of schizophrenia. So that will be next Wednesday, the 15th of March. I hope that that was helpful. Thank you so much for joining, and I will stay on in case there have been any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. I'm looking forward to next week. We don't have any questions in the chat at the moment. But I'm sure we might get some probably next week or when people have had a look at the recorded session. Remember, it'll be on the Carlam Cymru section of the e-sgol website. Thanks very much and looking forward to next week.
Thank you.